long-term strategies to address decarbonization, to support the Paris Agreement's 2-degree and preferably the 1.5-degree goal. Experts will share key factors in developing effective decarbonization policies, implementation experience, especially from the People's Republic of China, actions to achieve a just transition, and the role of the private sector in decarbonization, and what measures will help accelerate private investment in clean technologies.
Afternoon, morning, and evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining East Asia Forum 2022. Let us now begin the plenary session. I'll give the floor to Ms. Sujata Gupta, Director, Sustainable Infrastructure Division of the East Asia Department. Over to you, Sujata.
Thank you, Akiko. Again, a very good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and a warm welcome to this plenary session on planning and acting for effective decarbonization. I will be the moderator for this session. As we have heard in the introductory session, climate change is and has finally been acknowledged as one of the greatest global threats today, and one that many future generations will continue to face if we don't act now. Many countries have announced targets of reaching net zero emissions of carbon over the next 30 to 50 years. And to achieve this and to limit global temperature increase in the century to 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, all countries will need to undergo unprecedented societal and economic transformation. Let me just present some findings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the sixth assessment report of the Working Group 3 on mitigation that are relevant for our session today. One, the unit cost of several low emission technologies have fallen continuously since 2010, and innovative policy packages have enabled these cost reductions and supported global adoption. But clearly we need a lot more of this. Number two, projected cumulative future CO2 emissions from the existing and currently planned fossil fuel infrastructure exceeds the total cumulative net CO2 emissions that would limit warming to 1.5 and are approximately equal to the total cumulative net CO2 emissions that limit warming to 2 degrees. So if everything else was zero, the current infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure, and the planned is sufficient to give us a 2 degrees increase in temperature. So given the above, enhanced mitigation and action to shift development towards sustainability is necessary. This will have distributional consequences within and between countries. So attention to equity and broad and meaningful participation of all can build social trust and deepen the support for these transformative changes. Fourth, financial flows fall short of the levels that are required for mitigation across all sectors and regions. And this challenge is the largest in developing countries. Scaling up mitigation financial flows can be supported by clear policy choices and signals from the government and international community. So to address some of these concerns, we are very privileged today to have with us a very knowledgeable and well-regarded speakers who will share their wide expertise and experience in promoting decarbonization in the region. They will discuss key factors that affect emissions reduction, effective policies and measures, and experience from first movers. Also, how to achieve a just transition and the challenges and opportunities faced in carbon abatement. Also, we will look at the role of international organizations such as the ADB, governments, and the private sector. It is my honor to introduce the first keynote speaker, Mr. Richard Barron. He is the executive director of the 2050 Pathways Platform, a multi-country initiative gathering government officials, international financial institutions, think tanks, and organizations with an interest in developing the Paris Agreement's long-term low emissions development strategies. Since 2017, the platform has been active in more than 40 countries, mostly outside OECD. Richard held positions on climate policy at the IEA, OECD, and with various research institutes in France and the US. His work covered international negotiations, energy and climate policy, trade and competitiveness, market mechanisms, industry and public procurement, and the broad alignment of public policy making with the climate imperative. He will present robust long-term low greenhouse gas development strategies towards net zero. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sujata. I hope you can see this and hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
And can you see my screen?
I could, but now no.
Oh, hold on. So I'm going to try to do that more properly. Yeah. Sorry about this. Somewhat disconnected. Let me do it from here. My apologies for this glitch. Microsoft PowerPoint seems to be having
no issues.
But before I restart all this, I just wanted to thank you very much for the opportunity, Sujata, and for the kind introduction. It's been a privilege to be able to participate this morning. What I'd like to do is indeed present not the many aspects of decarbonization policies, but one particular one, which is how to secure that countries actually manage to the best of their capability. And for this, the Paris Agreement has actually provided, so can you see my screen now? I hope now it's okay.
Yes, it's showing. Please go to presentation mode.
Here we go. My apologies for that. So
Great.
indeed, what I wanted to present is some lessons from the work we have done on this particular topic of long-term low-emission greenhouse gas development strategies. You've introduced the 2050 Pathways platform, so here is a bit of a map of our activities. I will not go through the details of all this engagement, but basically we provide a space for countries to actually congregate and exchange experiences of what it actually means to plan ahead into the middle of a century, this huge challenge that represents a shift to a low-carbon economic development. We have a number of countries that we work with and support us, and we provide a number of support in countries to develop capacity for that work to be undertaken with the most inclusive fashion. Just a few examples from the region. In Indonesia, we've held a number of workshops with stakeholders from Ministry of Environment and Finance, provided knowledge on structure and themes of LTS, and combined some funding from German colleagues for modeling capability that was used for the strategy that was submitted to the UNFCCC. In Vietnam, we had also similar knowledge engaging activities, and ditto with Cambodia, where we supported the elaboration of the TORs of the long-term strategy for the country. So we intervene whenever we think there is a gap and whenever our expertise can be useful. We supported one of the first long-term strategies from the region, from the Marshall Islands, way back, I think, in 2018, and also supported the one of Tonga. Now, before I turn to the actual presentation, I wanted to say how important it is for the multilateral development banks to be engaged in this process. You play a key role, a critical role, in the development of a number of countries in the region. I think your efforts to align your lending opportunities with the requirements of the Paris Agreement to provide climate resilient and low carbon development are absolutely essential to support initiatives in those countries. So I wanted to commend you for doing this and for holding this, this particular session. Now, I too wanted to say a few words about the IPCC and the AR6, the sixth assessment report. There is a number of super interesting information there about how to actually achieve the decarbonization of our economies. A lot of technology details are there that one might look at, but what I thought was particularly interesting and a little outside the usual scope is this particular piece of text that talks about how to shift development path and the complexity of doing that. In particular, it involves complex social learning. Even we are, in fact, in a position to assume that there are going to be significant gains. The shifts in development pathways result from both sustained political interventions and bottom-up changes in public opinion. And all of this is not just technology, it's not just engineering. It takes a long process to actually achieve this. Now, arguably, we have 3 decades to achieve this change, but we need to get started now. We should probably have started 10 years ago. So I think it's important to remember that this is a social process and not just a technology and hardware and infrastructure process. So this is what we've seen as effective ways to actually do this long-term planning to low carbon. We see this as more or less 5 steps, and I will, of course, use them in a very stylized fashion. We think we need to start, first of all, by a political recognition that there is a need for a long-term strategy, that this is an important part of how the country needs to think about its future. And so the higher up this decision is made by the head of state, the prime minister, the head of parliament, or ministries, the better it is. This is to catalyze the work. to set up the governance for the work to be undertaken in an inclusive fashion. I think the second step, which is equally important, is to actually align climate change objectives with a socio-economic vision. Countries all have aspirations for development, for specific elements that they miss and that they'd like to achieve. And we need to secure those before and at the same time as we envision how to go for low carbon development. And this is then that we can identify the critical questions that the policymakers will have to deal with. What are the trade-offs that they might be seeing? What are the opportunities that they might be seeing? So second, visioning there. Third and fourth work together, and they are about trying to quantify what it actually means, because without a certain quantification, there's no imagination of what the country might look like in 3 or 4 decades in the low carbon world. So you need to be able to describe how that change is going to take place, to describe the emission pathways, to describe exactly what sectors are going to shift when, what sort of technologies are going to be engaged. And this is done in connection with stakeholders who are going to be challenging in some cases, some of these assumptions, which is fine. But without putting some meat on the bone of the decarbonization, it's very difficult for people to have a constructive discussion. And this is also the place, by the way, where you should have a number of indicators that are going to matter to different ministries. Some ministries are going to be worried about providing enough buildings for a growing population. They want to find out whether your projections actually make that happen. Some others are going to ask questions about the distributive impacts. We talked about just transition in this introduction, and I think it's critical to be able to say, as we're going to shift, there might be some effect on prices and on incomes, and this is how we envision remedying those effects. So the stakeholder consultations, a whole of society approach to this to be able to confront views on the future and the various options that are on the table is particularly important. And once something comes out of it is the point where the policymaking needs to pick up from the long-term strategy. And this is also where multilateral development banks can be very useful. Mind you, I think we see an increasing interest of MDBs in actually engaging in the process of LTS itself. And I think it's critical because you also have a lot of knowledge to bring to this exercise. So these are the various stages and the various people that might be engaged in this exercise. Now, I'm going to finish with a few lessons learned from the work that we've been doing on this. So I want to stress again the importance of the socio-economic vision. Identifying those trade-offs is particularly important, and because this is what you will need to address when you draw the emission pathways. If you look at the Morocco and Nigeria submissions, they've only so far provided for those visions. They did not rush into actually doing quantification on just about everything. Instead, they've identified what's critical to them. And in the next phase that's starting now, actually, the platform is actually supporting them to do the quantification to analyze exactly those issues they've identified. But those long-term visions are actually on the UNFCCC website. It's important also to join existing processes. Creating a whole new process for the LTS that is at a distance from everything else that's been done, whether it's socio-economic development plans that exist in your country, the NDC process, the national adaptation plans, would be a bit of a waste of resources. And I just wanted to point out Fiji's that made an effort right from the start to actually have a full alignment of its NDC with the LTS net zero objective, because this was done as one process. It's important that there be a dedicated government body and aim for a whole of government approach. There are, we know, various interministerial committees that exist in most countries. So, and the cabinet approval then can come in the end of the process. But those bodies are important to follow the work because, as I said, without a whole of government, without all of the government stakeholders present, you're likely to miss some critical pieces of the challenge of decarbonization and climate resilience. The engagement of stakeholders, and I'm listing them here, the private sector, civil society, regions, and donors, for a deeper discussion on the challenges and opportunities of climate change is also quite important. Singapore has done a rather exemplary exercise in that space. In the Marshall Islands as well, there was an effort to go out to the various islands and hold fora to actually explain what the country wanted to do to deal with the issue of mitigation in particular. And you can find all this in their submission to the UNFCCC as well. Further on the lessons, I think it's important that the stakeholders identify what matters to them and bring that to the table of the exercise of the long-term strategy. We have, and we find, for instance, that the ministries of finance and economy are a little bit silent in the exercise. We think that there are many more issues that they might want to raise that relate, for instance, to the macroeconomic implications of the transition. Not because we think it's going to add to the challenge, but because if we don't put these issues on the table, we will not work on those solutions. So I think it's very important to have issues such as near-term inflation, distributive impacts, the rise of debt, the changes in trade flows be put on the table. There are going to be trade-offs, there are going to be opportunities. If you don't ask those questions, there won't be answers along those lines. I've seen in the Thailand long-term strategy that there's a good macroeconomic impact assessment, but it's done in a way where it's largely based on the carbon price analysis of how to achieve the mitigation goals, whereas the country itself has done and is about to do a lot more than just that. So, but it's a good start. It's an indication that you need to have those sorts of issues on the table. Backcasting is important. Start from the long-term future, set yourself some ambition. A lot of countries, as I've said, have established net zero goals and try to work back and see what it means today. In the case of Tonga, there are now in the LTS 9 first steps. So instead of saying 2050 looks like this, they say for 2050 to look like this, this is what we need to do now. And these are steps we need to take. The same goes with the Chinese long-term strategy, where we see 2030 objectives in terms of non-fossil fuel objectives, among many others. It's important, and it's not done enough, to integrate climate vulnerability issues. The long-term strategy started out on a foot which was largely on mitigation. We think it is very important to reflect that in 30 years' time, most countries will face much harsher conditions due to climate change. And that has some impacts on what options might be on the table for them to react to that. Indonesia has done a bit of an exercise along those lines. I think it's also important to reflect on the global effort to net zero and what it means for individual economies. We see now the geopolitical repercussions of various events that have on energy prices that affect everybody. We see this also on economic growth. We see this on trade. There are certain decisions that are being made by certain regions that will affect trade because they will not buy the same products they used to. And yet there are countries who are extremely vulnerable to some trade revenues. Mention Nigeria, which mentions that oil and gas price exposure is going to be an issue to their future. And last but not least, I think it's very important to establish some monitoring and reviewing of the LT-LEDs, because science is changing, technology costs are changing, the funding conditions are changing, economic growth projections are often wrong and need to be readjusted. And if you look at the UNFCCC website for the communications on long-term strategies, here are a list of countries that have actually already revised their long-term strategies to accommodate for those changes, but also accommodate their change in ambition. I wanted to also maybe pick up on what the COP26 said on LTS, much to the surprise of some players and observers, but in fact, it does justice to the importance of the exercise. There's an encouragement to communicate by COP27 long-term strategies towards just transitions. Its importance, the importance of having those two things together is should not be underestimated. There's an encouragement to update the existing ones, and a pointer to the fact that there will be a synthesis report of long-term strategies. And last but not least, and I think that was the intent and the spirit probably of parties when they decided to put long-term strategies in the Paris Agreement, they note the importance of aligning NDCs with LTS. So I'm going to leave you with those words of wisdom from the Prime Minister of Fiji at COP23, who said, having a good plan is not a sufficient condition for success, but not having one is always a recipe for failure. So I invite you to consider long-term strategies as a process for a robust, inclusive, an ambitious transition to low carbon and climate resilient development. Thank you very much for the opportunity today. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard, for a very interesting presentation. And yes, you rightly pointed out, engagement of stakeholders is very important, and especially finance and economic ministries. We'll have discussion on your presentation later. For now, we will move on to the next presentation. Our next keynote speaker is the esteemed Dr. Li Gao, Director General of the Department of Climate Change, Ministry of Ecology and Environment of the People's Republic of China. Dr. Li has played an important role in the formulation of PRC's strategies, plans, and policies to address climate change. He led the work to propose PRC's medium and long-term climate change action goals. He is also leading the establishment and construction of PRC's national carbon emissions trading system. He participated in the UN climate change negotiations as deputy head of the Chinese government delegation. He will be speaking on PRC's transition to a low carbon economy. His speech is in Chinese, so please, if you have not already, please move to the English interpretation. Dr. Li Gao, warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
好，谢谢 Sujata Gupta 女士。
Thank you, Sujata Gupta. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be invited and join today's forum on behalf of Ministry of Eco and Environment. I'd like to congratulate on the convening of this forum. I'd like to use this opportunity to thank all parties for the support to China's effort in responding to climate change. Climate change is a key global challenge. Now Paris Agreement is in full implementation process. UNFCCC, a third review report by the working group, reminded us again that effective implementation of Paris Agreement is urgent. Asia Pacific is a key growth driver of a world economy. Green and low carbon transition has a global significance. Now today we are focusing on effective decarbonization activities and actions to share our experiences to help us to better take actions. China has been putting emphasis on climate change. We have been implementing national strategy on climate change. September 2020 September 22 of 2020, President Xi said that China aims to peak carbon emission by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. That is China's key strategic decisions to have a sustainable development and build the community of a shared destiny. In the carbon peaking and carbon neutrality has therefore been included in a key national planning process. We have also issued opinions on the implementation of carbon peaking and carbon neutrality, and we have also developed action plans. We have also submitted China's low carbon development strategy to Secretariat of UNFCCC. We're also going to publish the sectorial action plan and implementation plan, including transportation, finance, technology, carbon credits, buildings, and energy, and several sectors, so we can form a 1+N policy system. We're going to build a low-carbon circular economy to have a clean, efficient, and green energy system, accelerate decarbonization. In the 14th five-year period, we are going to strictly control the incremental carbon emission, and during the 15th five-year plan, we are going to decrease carbon emission. We are accelerating the development of low carbon transportation, developing low carbon buildings, and also developing key technologies, including CCUS and their deployment and dissemination, and also strengthen our control on non-CO2 emission like methane. We have listed these goals and tasks in the 14th five-year plan and the 2035 midterm planning. We require the relevant ministries included carbon peaking, carbon neutrality in their performance evaluation indicators, strengthen these KPIs assessment, and the implementation of the carbon goals would be included in the supervision done by the central government. We're also going to publish the 2035 National Climate Adaptation Strategy to strengthen capacity of climate change adaptation. China also has achieved effective outcome. We are seeing our carbon intensity has been reducing, and our energy structure have been improving. By end of 2020, our per unit GDP carbon intensity reduced by 50% on 2005, and the coal fire decreased from 75% to 56%. Non-fossil fuel has taken 19% of the total share. Renewable energy investment, installed capacity, power generated, number of patents has been number one for several years. The new energy cars owned by Chinese nationals accounted for 50% of the world totals, and China is the largest producer and consumer of new energy vehicles. We also use market mechanism to reduce GHG emission. In China enacted the global ETS trading. This is the emission trade market with the largest GHG coverage. Now the first contract period closed, and 99.5% of a contract were honored and carried out. Now the ETS is playing a role in setting price for carbon. We are going to continue the regulation and operation of this market, so market mechanism can have a full play in the process. We are also actively developing laws, policies, and the standard system for carbon emission, establish a unified carbon calculation and assessment system, and to establish a CO2 cap control system. We also realize carbon peaking and carbon neutrality is very challenging for China. Developed countries, after they finished the industrialization, after the emission already peaked, it took a long time for developed countries to reach carbon neutrality. However, China has the largest population. Most of our energy, coal take a large part of our energy, and heavy industry accounted for a large share in our industry mix. And the time for our development is much shorter than the developed countries. We are facing a lot of challenges, including economic development and growth and social and economic growth. Nevertheless, China is going to carry out our commitment. We are going to steadily going towards and honor our goal of carbon peaking and carbon neutrality. The challenges faced by China are also common challenges faced by most developing countries. While having low carbon transitions of China, China also sticks to multilateralism to establish a fair and just global climate governance system. China announced would no longer finance any overseas coal power project. China will build a green belt and road, and to do our best to provide tangible and practical support to other developing countries in their low carbon transitions. Ladies and gentlemen, all humans share the same planet. President Xi, during COP26, and provided a written speech, says that we shall protect the multilateral consensus, and all parties should join hands to protect this common home for all of us. Now we're going to have a COP27 by end of this year, and China is going to support Egypt to ensure there is going to be another successful COP. China would strengthen our cooperation with all stakeholders to contribute to the global sustainable development and to a beautiful and sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Li Gao, for a very, very informative presentation, and also for highlighting the success and the progress that the PRC has had in terms of moving towards its targets, its very ambitious targets. Dr. Li Gao will be leaving for another commitment, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank him once again for his speech. But Dr. Li Gao, before you leave, we will take a group photograph. So request all the panelists and speakers to turn on their cameras.
All the panelists, may I please request to turn on your video. Dr. Li Gao is already there. Richard, please turn on your video. And panelists, Arif, Susanna, yes. Thank you so much. We are good.
I think we are good to move on now. So thank you once more, Dr. Li Gao. It was a pleasure having you with us. Let's move now to the panel discussion. And it's my pleasant duty to introduce our expert panelists one by one and ask them some questions and for them to share their thoughts. Let me start with Ms. Noelle O'Brien. She's with the Asian Development Bank and is the newly appointed Chief of Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Thematic Group, concurrently Director Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management. Previously, Noelle worked on expanding ADB's work on mitigation and adaptation investments in the 14 Pacific member countries, as well as raising climate finance. Prior to joining ADB, Noelle was with UK Aid and has worked with a number of international organizations in Southeast Asia and Africa. So welcome, Noelle. Let me start by asking you a question. As a development partner, what will ADB do to speed up decarbonization in Asia other than financing infrastructure? Noelle?
Thank you, Sujata. Can I just confirm that you can still hear me clearly?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great, yeah. So thank you for inviting me to be part of today's panel. Very much appreciate the opportunity to share some of ADB's work in this important forum. Just to begin with, really, is to focus on ADB's new climate ambition. So at ADB, we recognize the role that we need to play in supporting our member countries to scale up climate actions, and particularly to serve as the climate bank for Asia and the Pacific region. This recognition has recently led us to announce an increase in our climate ambition of providing $100 billion of cumulative climate finance from 2019 to 2030. And out of this total, 34 billion will be for adaptation and resilience. And our commitment is that ADB sovereign operations will be fully aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement by July 1st, 2023. 85% of our operations, or our non-sovereign operations, will also be aligned by that period in 2023, with full alignment of non-sovereign operations by July 2025. Now, in order to achieve that ambition, we are pursuing 4 major approaches. So the first one is advancing policy support for climate actions. And this includes supporting countries to strengthen implementation of their nationally determined contributions through, for example, our dedicated technical support facility, which was known as NDC Advance. This aims to assist in refining and translating NDCs into climate investment plans, improve our DMC access to improving DMC to external public and private climate finance, including through innovative financing mechanisms. And also to develop methods and approaches to establish baselines and monitoring tools to measure and gauge DMC progress on climate actions and ADB's contribution to these actions. As Richard already brought up in his presentation, it is essential that the multilateral development banks, including ADB, play an important role in providing support for NDC implementation. While climate finance flows do need to increase, so does the capacity of the developing countries to identify investment needs and opportunities and develop NDCs into investment plans. So we see that ADB's support will be very important for DMCs throughout this NDC process. Following on from Richard's presentation, we're also stepping up our support for countries to develop their long-term low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development strategies, or the long-term strategies. This is to guide a country's short and medium-term decision-making aligned not only with its NDCs, but also its existing national and sectoral development plans, and also the adaptation plans. We see that such upstream policy support will inform our country partnership strategies and identification of investments for our pipelines, and also including in these investments policy-based lending to support overall climate agendas. ADB has also had a long-standing engagement with carbon markets. ADB recognizes the need to mobilize carbon finance through international carbon markets, especially those emerging under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, to support DMCs in achieving targets articulated under their NDCs and raising ambition over time. In this context, ADB has established its Article 6 support facility which is providing technical, capacity building, and policy-based development support for enhancing DMC's readiness to participate in and take advantage of the international carbon markets envisaged under the framework of Article 6. At COP26 in Glasgow, we also launched a new carbon fund, the Climate Action Catalyst Fund. And this aims to help our member countries meet their NDC targets and raise ambition over time by mobilizing carbon finance through the purchase of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or carbon credits, under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, with the intent to enhance the financial viability of greenhouse gas mitigation actions in Asia and the Pacific. Now, in addition, some of the other areas, we're also exploring new opportunities for investments in climate mitigation through investments in renewable energy and storage, energy efficiency, low carbon transport, and supporting countries in just transitioning. We are confident that the energy transition mechanism, which ADB launched at COP, will have a dramatic impact on demand for private sector climate finance for renewable energy. And for those who aren't familiar with ADB's energy transition mechanism, it is a mechanism to reduce the coal power generation. Now, thirdly, I want to focus in on ADB's efforts to scale up transformational adaptation projects, which focus on resilience outcomes. Well, we can no longer treat adaptation as an incremental add-on to development. We need to look at climate risk as the starting point to inform development, especially in climate sensitive sectors such as agriculture, water, and urban development. Equally, it is equally important that adaptation solutions benefit the most vulnerable, especially women who can face the brunt of climate actions. So at COP26, ADB launched the Community Resilience Partnership Program to scale up local solutions on adaptation. Lastly, in this area is increasing climate actions in the private sector operations through new technologies and innovation in climate financing, and also by exploring new areas of business for private sector climate operations. And in this context, I would just like to mention the example of ADB's ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance and Green Recovery Platform. This is expected to leverage as much as $7 billion of green finance, some of which will be from ADB resources, but most from capital markets and private sector investors for low carbon infrastructure. So thank you, Sujata, for letting me share some of those initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Noelle. Now, let's move on to Mr. Russo Sugimoto. He's the director in the Ministry of Environment, Government of Japan, and has been with the ministry since 1999. He's responsible for MOEJ's strategy for international cooperation, especially in the Asian and African regions. He recently developed the initiative for marine plastic debris in ASEAN +3 and has contributed to developing the national policy on climate change and has been promoting decarbonization technologies such as renewable energy, waste to energy, and energy savings. Prior to his current position, Sugimoto-san was seconded to ADB, where he established a new trust fund, the Japan Fund for Joint Credit Mechanism, which supports ADB's projects to introduce advanced low carbon technologies. So welcome, Sugimoto-san. I'd like to ask you that developed countries are better positioned to lead the decarbonization effort because of their relative wealth and productivity. And recently, Japan has raised its 2030 GHG emission reduction target to 46% compared to 2013, and also committed to achieve net zero by 2050. Could you briefly tell us more about the long-term plans and roadmaps that Japan is developing to reach these ambitious targets? Can you keep your intervention to 4 minutes, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata. Thank you very much also for the inviting me. And let me share my screen. Just a moment, please. So I hope I haven't. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can see your slide. Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you. As Sujata mentioned, we already set up the long-term strategy twice. In 2019, we set a long-term strategy and submitted, and 2020, former Prime Minister Suga announced carbon neutrality by 2050, so that we revised the long-term strategy the last year. In addition to these long-term strategies, we also revised the NDCs for the 2030s as 46% reductions by 2030 compared with the 2013 level. This is, you can see the graph. It's really scientifically in line with 2050 carbon neutrality. So that is our current target of the for the carbon neutrality and midterm target. And then you know, Japan already has a progress and also the result. Since 2013, we steadily reduced GHG emissions for the last 6 years. So this the result, also the influence to the discussion of the midterm target, and we can upgrade our target as a 46% reduction, and the 50% we strenuously make an effort for the 50% reductions by 2030. That is also the ambitious target for the developed countries. Then there, I think that just a moment. Okay, for the midterm strategies, we have a detailed plan for each sectors, estimated emissions, and since the most sectors of the GHG emission is from the energy sectors, so that for our target, energy sector's CO2 emission reduction is very key. And then we identified each sector's reductions. This is not purely same level of the each sectors from 38% to the 46% or 50% for the some commercial and other sectors. And the residential sectors, 66% reductions is a target. This means from the current situations and existing technologies, we could try this ambitious target in each sectors. So that one. And then the main policy and the measures listed in the plan. Of course, as I mentioned, the planning, renewable energy and energy conservation is a key. But in addition to that, the industrial and transport sectors needs to be developed for the such further the reductions. And also the cross-sector strategies, we also promote zero carbon cities and also leading the decarbonized regions, because this is not purely the same levels developed. Rather, the region or some local areas can be achieved the carbon neutrality beforehand. Such kind of the experience can be replicated to other areas. So we try to create more than 100 leading decarbonized regions by 2030s. And then, as Richard mentioned, other sectors or other stakeholders are also keen. Many private sectors request us to set ambitious target from TCFD, science-based target, and the RE100. Private sector already commits such kind of the ambitious target by own. And then they also request us to set the target because otherwise their own voluntary target or their own voluntary effort is not sufficient for that. So that's why we create we revise the long-term strategy to encourage them and also to support them. So that is the Japanese strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sugimoto-san, for a very, very informative presentation. And now I would like to move on to our next panelist, Dr. Arif Vijaya. He's the Program Director of World Resources Institute, Indonesia, and focuses on overseeing programmatic works under agriculture, forest, and land use portfolio, as well as climate, energy, cities, and the oceans portfolio. So he covers practically everything relevant for us. His expertise lies around tropical forest landscapes and their impacts on climate change, low carbon development policies, and national GHG inventories. Prior to WRI, he worked at Thunen Institute of International Forestry and Forest Economics and the Center for International Forestry Research. So welcome, Dr. Arif. Now, again, Indonesia has set itself a bold target of net zero by 2060. So based on your wide knowledge and experience supporting climate change mitigation and adaptation in Indonesia, to what extent do you think the current decarbonization policies would help Indonesia achieve its current target? And which short-term and medium-term actions, policies, or planning efforts would you suggest to the Indonesian government to promote a transition towards decarbonization? Dr. Arif?
Thank you, Sujata, and thank you for having me in this forum. Very interesting audience here. So I think with regards to Indonesia, as we know that Indonesia has submitted the second NDC July last year, whereby Indonesia decided not to increase the climate ambitions, still trying to reduce the emissions by 29% to 41% in 2030. Also, Indonesia has submitted the long-term strategies to UNFCCC, also July last year, whereby the government planned to achieve the net zero target at the latest by 2060 or prior to 2060. And also one big chunk of the LTS document submitted by the government was the plan for Indonesia to achieve the net zero target for from forestry and land use sectors by 2030. With regards to your first questions, how does Indonesia is doing currently with this kind of commitment and how to achieve this current climate ambition? I think we could see in different perspective. One, we could see it on the positive sides, whereby Indonesia or the government has been working quite actively with regards to, for example, mainstreaming the low carbon narrative into the 5-year development planning. So this is actually the first ever since the country has declared its independence in 1945 that Indonesia has the first 5-year development planning that include the environmental aspects like emissions intensity, emissions reduction into the macro indicators target. The second is since the last big fire season in 2016, the government has been also very, protective in the sense that trying to mitigate the forest and peatland fires in Indonesia, as we know that the country has the largest tropical peatland in Southeast Asia, which is actually, this is a wetland ecosystem. Once it is actually converted and drained, it becomes very vulnerable to fires. And when it's burned, it will release a huge amount of carbons to the atmosphere. The last huge fires in 2016, even it spread around to other Asian countries. And this, since 2016, the government has been very, strong in mitigating the forest and then fires. The third, this is also the 5-year consecutive years for Indonesia since 2017, whereby deforestation has reduced in the country. Indonesia is the third largest tropical forest country after Brazil and Democratic Republic of Congo. Sure, in its NDC target, forestry and land use sector has played the most important role in contributing to the emissions reductions target, followed by the energy sectors. That's kind of the commitment. However, if we see the energy sector, we could also see that the commitment from the government falls short because, for example, the government has commitment to achieve 23% of emissions, 23% of renewable energy mix by 2025, but until now, until today, they achieve only less than half of it, like 12% of renewable energy target. And as we know, more than 60% of energy sector in Indonesia still heavily depending on the coal power plant or coal products. So this is also another challenge. As we know that there are, of course, several initiatives trying to accelerate, the transitions of fossil fuel power plant. President Jokowi, in one occasion, committed to do an early retirement of about 5.5 gigawatt of coal power plant in Indonesia, but with international support. Indonesia, as one of developing nations in Southeast Asia, although it's also a part of the G20 members countries, still really depend to international support, including from multilateral bank like Asian Development Bank to accelerate their ambitions in achieving the climate commitments. And the commitment from Indonesia is very ambitious at the moment, especially because, even with the strong leadership and a strong ambition to achieve the climate mitigation and adaptation target, even with the strategic alliance and partnership between state actors, public-private partnership, private sectors there. But the most crucial thing is really to have an innovative financing scheme that comes from multilateral sources like ADB, bilateral sources from international donor countries, but also coming from other innovative sources like carbon tax, carbon trading, and so forth. So yeah, I will just end my intervention, but there are a lot still to learn for Indonesia from China, from Japan, from other countries, whereby we could be more ambitious, not only in the plan, but also in implementing of the regulations. The evil is not in the regulations, but the evil is always on the details, on the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, always the devil is in the detail, right? Thank you so much, Dr. Arif. Let me move on to the next panelist, Ms. Susanna Sumku. She is the acting CEO of the New Recovery Policy Accelerator of the Government of Mongolia. So the new recovery policy adopted by the Parliament of Mongolia in December 2021 aims to solve binding constraints and reduce negative socio-economic impacts from the COVID pandemic. Susanna has a track record of designing and developing policy, institutional and legal mechanisms for development planning in Mongolia. Formerly, she was the Director General of the Development Policy and Planning Department at the Ministry of Economy and Development, responsible for formulating long-term, medium-term, and short-term national development policies. She was the focal point for the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the NDC Partnership Platform for Mongolia. So welcome again, Susanna. Now, Mongolia's economy is heavily dependent on coal as a resource and coal as a primary source of energy, both for heating and power generation. Despite this, the government acknowledges the need to reduce carbon emissions and increase the share of renewable energy technologies in its energy mix. So, Susanna, what priority actions could the government undertake to promote a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies in Mongolia, and to adequately compensate those who would be impacted by the transition? Susanna?
Thank you, Sujata, and thank you for the ADB and ADB Institute for organizing this important event and having me as a panelist here. So, so far it's been really interesting discussions, and what I keep noticing is that decarbonization and just transition needs to happen in the context of each country as development features and the development paradigms. So in Mongolia's case, it's quite unique because we have some weather challenges. There's around like 8 to 9 months heat demand in the country out of 12 months. And then we have this challenge of this cold weather, minus 30 degrees in the wintertime. And then as well as because of course, some development challenges, including urban-rural development imbalance, there's great heat demand in terms of from households as well as the private sector. The government has been prioritizing the policy objective to develop rural development in terms of bringing businesses there, because there's vast natural resources and potential for social development as well. But to do that, the key economic constraint is energy, aside from transport and ports, connectivity, etc. So as such, based on these systemic challenges, we've done some analysis based on the growth diagnostics we've done with I5s, with ADB, and as well as other partners, and that we've done on our own domestically. And we've tried to use the COVID challenge as an opportunity to identify how can we shift to a different paradigm moving forward in the medium and long term. The Vision 2050, the long-term policy document in Mongolia, does include a whole chapter on green development. And these green development issues, including climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, is mainstreamed into the economic and social issues in the Vision 2050 as well. So you could easily say that the long-term commitment is there for climate adaptation and mitigation. And I do also want to mention that from the policy side, the past 4 or 5 years, the parliament as well as the government has taken accelerated action to ensure policy coherence. Because in order to ensure adaptation targets, we need to make sure that the social as well as the real sectors need to have a coherent strategy for moving towards these targets. So this has been a challenge because there's this mindset, traditional mindset in real sectors such as mining, which is a big base for economic structure, as well as other sectors like energy, transport. How do we think about climate adaptation in these sectors? So a lot of capacity building as well as policy planning methodologies had to be formulated. And as such, in 2019, the parliament approved the constitutional amendment. So there is a very strong base for policy coherence and integration. And based on this, as you said, Sujata, the parliament has adopted the new recovery policy. And the policy was actually designed based on the needs from the private sector in terms of how do we go beyond the current COVID challenges that we're having in 2020 and 2021. How do we shift into the new normal in a transition that is just, but also how do we strengthen the base for economic key structural sectors? So to answer your question, I would say in a very brief answer, we are taking on twofold approach in terms of policy priority. First one is we are considering or prioritizing the need for carbon reduction or absorption capacity, strengthening carbon absorption capacity. Within this framework, the president actually just initiated the Billion Tree Initiative, and private sectors have already joined this initiative. They've signed contracts. For instance, the Mongolian Banking Association committed 2 billion MNT annually into the joint fund that was established for the Billion Trees. So we think that these efforts are really important, and not only, of course, moving towards decarbonization, but also building the base for PPP, private-public partnerships. Because without this, we will not be able to move towards decarbonization or carbon peaking. The second approach that we are upholding is the increasing the share of renewable energy in our energy source structure. For Mongolia right now, there's 17.6% is renewable energy, and this is made up of solar, hydro, wind, as well as other minor sources. But our priority would be to increase the share of the renewable energy sources. And going forward, to ensure this, technologies will be important, but also, firstly, technology in a sense to increase the efficiency of current energy use. Secondly, looking at alternative sources to meet energy supply. New recovery policy does include statutes on looking into alternate sources like hydrogen, green hydrogen, nuclear energy, as well as strengthening the current energy sources. But we have to keep in mind that Mongolia's energy system, as well as the social livelihood of Mongolian people, depend on the heating demand. Heating demand is expected to increase around 7 to 8% annually moving forward. We've done some projections until 2030, as well as for power demand around 11% increase annually moving forward. So for us, of course, we would really like to provide or use renewable energy for our basic power or heating supply. But at the same time, in order to transition to that, we need to make sure to meet the demand, so we can overcome the cold, very cold, harsh winters. In terms of just transition, my point, the new recovery policy's key basis or the key purpose is to ensure inclusive growth. So how do we make sure that there is balanced contribution of government, private sector roles in moving towards the energy targets that we have? So how do we bring in blended finance approaches and solutions into this? So these will be the key questions for us moving forward. But we would say that to end my remarks, firstly, carbon reduction absorption. We do have the National Adaptation Plan formulated. We have the NDC targets as well as the action plan. We're part of the NDC partnership platform. So there are a lot of avenues we can move forward and foster further in the future. So I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susanna. I think one point you forgot to emphasize, you kept saying very cold climate. What you forgot to emphasize when we talk of very cold climate, we are talking of -40 degrees C. So that really gives And you know, spring there is like -5, -10. So I think the Mongolians really look forward to their summer. So thank you very much, Susanna. Yes, and I think it's difficult to immediately talk of energy transition in Indonesia, in Mongolia to non-fossil, but we can look at the incremental demand and look at non-fossil options for the incremental demand for energy. So you spoke about public-private partnerships. So this is just the right time to move on to our next speaker, who represents the private sector. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Assad Razuk, who is the CEO of Gurian Energy, the Pan-Asia renewable energy business, headquartered in Singapore and focused on the development, ownership, and operation of solar, wind, and storage assets. Assad has been a leader in the renewables and environment sector and has established and led several businesses, building and operating innovative and often first of their kind clean energy and carbon abatement projects in Asia and the United States. He was previously an investment banker at Nomura International in London and has also worked with Pricewaterhouse. He currently holds positions with many organizations, for example, Renewable Institute, Client Earth, EB Impact. But what I find most interesting is that he's the host of the Angry Clean Energy Guy podcast. So Assad, we look forward to you sharing some of your emotions on clean energy. Now, Assad, the private sector plays a lead role in implementing government policies and plans and scaling up the decarbonization efforts. What is the experience of the private sector in developing renewable energy in Asia? And what can governments do to further enhance the participation of private investment in the upcoming energy transition? In other words, what is needed to shift beyond policy and planning to action and accountability to ramp up developing countries' renewable energy base? Assad, over to you.
Thanks for having me, Sujata. Look, I get really frustrated in forums like this about this conversation. At the moment, we're subsidizing fossil fuel subsidies to, I don't know, the 20 times more than renewables. And so the private sector really, our hands are tied. You know, Japan in March this year actually tripled some of its fossil fuel subsidies. Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea are big fossil subsidy supporters. And you know, it's just impossible to talk about decarbonization without mentioning the egregious state of fossil fuel subsidies in Asia, for example. So the private sector is there. It's actually financing anything that moves from a decarbonization perspective, but there are institutional blocks that are massive that are on the way. And so that we don't just talk about rich Asia, let me give you kind of an amazing contrast between two countries. Finland, population 6 million, is in the Arctic. Indonesia, population 270 million, is literally plastered on the equator in an incredibly sunny climate. Finland has more installed solar capacity than Indonesia. I mean, you know, like, what is wrong with that picture? I mean, so many things are wrong with that picture. It's just not funny. So the private sector is hampered at every step in the way in decarbonization. It's hampered because we're just talking, not acting. And because we don't behave as if we are in a climate emergency. And this just goes across the board. So everybody's planning things out to 2050 when we're actually frying the planet in the meantime. And the frustration, I mean, I would think at a private sector level is pretty high. We don't need government support. We don't need subsidies. We just need to have efficient permitting processes and a fair framework for competition. And simply put, we don't. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Assad. I think very thought-provoking comments, but excellent ones, I would say. We'll come back to them, hopefully, time permitting. We don't have much time, but let me move on to Richard. Richard, we would like to engage the audience. So I had a question for you, but I'll take the one that has come from the panel, from the audience. And this, I don't see who has sent the question, but I'll read it out. It says, great presentation. Many countries are working for mitigation and adapting climate change. Considering the 80-20 principle, the major sources of emissions are a handful of countries. Is there not a need to focus on the actions by these countries? Richard, quick response.
So, yeah, it is very true, but I would like to stress that most of these countries, in fact, almost all of the G20 countries have their plans laid out to achieve decarbonization. By 2050, I acknowledge that, Assad, it's an important point that they need to bring those back to today, but they're doing the job. It's a struggle from a policy planning and number of shifts that are necessary, fossil fuel subsidies being one. But also note that as a result of this, there's a huge picking up in policy discussions to try to align things. The Clean Energy Ministerial is taking a number of stands to bring countries together on issues such as decarbonization of heavy materials and policies to that effect. So those countries, I wouldn't say are dealt with, but they have taken some of the matters in their own hand. But I think it's also super critical that the other countries also have access to those policy solutions and to those clean technologies that Assad referred to. It's not just for the rich countries and the large economies to do this. It's also fair that the others don't end up receiving the old technologies, the old practices that we're no longer going to be using. So it's also very important that they plan ahead for what they would like to see in terms of low carbon and climate resilience aspirations. And it's also important because the actions of the rest of the world, in particular the G20, is going to have repercussions and shifts on all the other economies. So they have to plan ahead for this as well. I'd like maybe to offer one answer to what Assad was saying. You say you don't need subsidies, you don't need government actions. You need a lot of government actions to remove a lot of the barriers to a range of actions that you could take. Just in the power sector, we have entire regulatory approaches that have been formatted by fossil fuel use for decades. And we need to change those regulatory arrangements so that you can do your job as best as possible. But your points are well taken. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. I'll take another question from the audience. Has ADB developed action plan to reach the 100 billion target? Will Group C be the major contributor? Noel, would you like to respond to this, please?
Yeah, thank you, Sujata. So ADB has a number of overarching documents to guide climate change work already in place. So we have Strategy 2030 and the Operational Priority 3, which guides the overarching climate change approach. We also have our climate change operational framework, which was developed in 2017, reaching out to 2030. And we are now just in the process of developing a climate action plan, which will provide a more detailed roadmap for operations over the next 5 years. In terms of prioritizations of efforts, that is not something that we have fully agreed on yet. But I think, as Richard has already indicated, the efforts need to be spread across all of the countries. And obviously, Group A and Group B countries also play a vital role in reducing emissions, but also the work that needs to be done in relation to adaptation and resilience. So thank you.
Thank you, Noel. We have another question. This is on Mongolia. What's the program of Mongolia on planting trees? Will the private sector be involved? And any plans to cooperate with China on this? Susanna?
Thank you for the question. So the Billion Trees is a national initiative initiated and supported by the President, Honorable Mr. Russo himself. And so the idea of the Billion Trees is to launch a movement to plant trees, 1 billion trees by 2030 to address climate change, as well as combating desertification, which takes up around 76.9% of Mongolian land is affected by desertification. So by undertaking this Billion Trees initiative, we are hoping to increase forest coverage by 9%, GHG reduction by 600,000 tons, and 120 million hectares of highly deserted land will be reduced by 4%. So these are the key outcomes that we are hoping to achieve. As for the private sector, when the president attended the UN General Assembly and pre-returned from New York, he's actually held a meeting with around 21 mining companies, for instance, because mining sector will be key in contributing, among other, of course, private sectors. But I also wanted to draw this example from the mining companies because there's a commitment from these 21 companies to plant around 608 million trees. And there's a list of companies by how many trees they will be planting. Mongolia has just held a Mongolia Economic Forum, which is a pre-forum before the Davos Economic Forum. And these forums had a targeted discussion on green finance and green development, and then on billion trees. So during these events, there was a MOU or establishment of a joint fund for the billion trees financing. So of course, the big challenge with planting trees is maintenance. So when private sectors commit like this, it is really great that there will be also maintenance and support from that side as well. As for cooperation with international community, of course, we would be open. But firstly, this is a domestic movement, of course, initiated and led by key stakeholders participating in the development in the country. But we would, of course, be open to running the initiative at a regional or a global scale. Over to you, Sujata.
Thank you, Susanna. Let me ask Arif to come in as a neutral person in terms of not being government, not being private sector, to comment on Assad's remarks about subsidies, lack of solar capacity in Indonesia. So Arif, over to you.
Thank you, Sujata. I think a comment from Assad is quite intriguing, controversial, but I think that's the inconvenient truth, yeah? So I think the truth is the northern countries, like Finland, what has been mentioned before, but also Nordic countries, they are really advanced in terms of transitioning towards the clean and renewable energy, while the Southeast Asian countries, so Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, those are the three countries whereby very sticky in how those countries could actually really accelerate transition into the clean and renewable energy products or approach. The thing is, it's not only about the regulations. The subsidies is also another key, but I guess pretty much for the case of Indonesia, for example, or South Africa or Mongolia, for example, this really like the high dependency of the economy in the countries to the coal sector, and then this has to be, you know, really mitigated and minimized in a way that is transformative, not jeopardizing the labor sector in the coal sector, but at the same time also providing transformations, you know, in a way that trajectory to transforming towards more clean energy or low emissions from the coal sector. I may not be able to say anything more here, but I think what I said was before really how to combine between the strong leadership, political commitment, but also with partnership and, you know, sustainable innovative financing. This is really the key for those developing nations to accelerate the transition towards new, you know, and clean renewable energy. I think that will be from my side, Sujata.
Thank you, Arif. We have reached the end, but I'm going to take the liberty of a couple of minutes extra. Sugimoto-san, any comments on subsidies and what's the plan going forward?
Thank you very much. I think that, yes, I'm not sure Mr. Assad mentioned this subsidy, but we already have a kind of the carbon tax for the fossil fuels. But of course, this is not sufficient. So we are already discussing this for a long time for the how the carbon pricing is shaping for the Japanese economy. On the carbon neutrality, of course, this is also the very important target. But at the same time, the achievement of the SDGs or other targets, the virtuous cycle of the environment and also the economy is also the key for the for encouraging the other stakeholders. So that's why the in Asia, and also we have a much long experience for the collaboration with Asia, and then we understand the situation or condition of the Asia is different from the European countries, many island countries, and the resource is not so sufficient compared to others, so that the kind of the connectivity is more important. So just now we start a collaboration with Australia to produce renewable green hydrogen to provide Asia and the Pacific Islands. This is just a pilot project, but for the connectivity or connection of the such renewable energies is also the enhancing capacity of the Asia for the carbon neutrality. We'd like to collaborate with Asian countries for expanding our own and also their own capacity for carbon neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you, Sugimoto-san. And actually, Japan leads development assistance in Asia. So let me finally turn back to Assad and ask him his own question. I mean, throw back the question to you. So Assad, what you've raised is very concerning, and I'd like to hear from you what practical steps should be taken to address this issue. You know, we know there are subsidies, but there are political reasons behind these subsidies. So in your view, what can be done practically? Over to you, Assad.
Look, there's first of all, I mean, I think we have to always remember that climate change and pollution kill, right? So this is not some light topic about just subsidies. This is a topic about people's health and livelihoods. So it's quite fundamental. Therefore, barriers really just have to be just pushed aside. And there are three areas really that are critically important. You know, the first one is we must massively increase the deployment of renewable energy. I mean, that's got to run 5 times faster right now than it's been running across every country in Asia without exception. Maybe Vietnam, maybe India, and maybe China. So these 3 exceptions. Second, where things are actually being scaled, I would say properly. Second, this is an issue also about deforestation. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And then third, it's also about oceans and plastic. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. But when you compute the math correctly, so when you take into account the impact on society of fossil fuels, there should be enough impetus for government action to change all this. But I mean, we've been through 26 COPs. I mean, how many COPs do we still need, or IPCC reports, to actually act? And action is lacking. And I'll give you one very specific area where things can be done. Permitting. Accelerate permitting across the board for renewable energy projects in every country in Asia, and force the utilities to stop standing in the way. This is what Britain is doing, for example, because it's just announced that it's going to accelerate permitting for offshore wind by something like 4 years. I mean, that's just enormous as an impact.
Great, thank you. I think I don't want to give heart attacks to the organizers. We've exceeded the time allocated, and thank you, Assad, for setting the cat amongst the pigeons, if I may say so. But I'll definitely subscribe to your Angry Energy Guy podcast from now onwards. Very, very interesting. So now what remains is for me to wrap up, and I don't think there is any need. I think the solution lies in decarbonization and going all out for decarbonization. So as VP Saeed said, the mantra is decarbonization, and we should look at decarbonization as development. I would like to thank all the speakers. We have greatly benefited from your thoughts and experience, and really grateful to some of you who have joined this session at what may be an inconvenient time for you. So thanks very much for that. And I would also like to thank the colleagues who are organizing this forum, my team, and of course, the audience for their active participation. Thank you all, and the session is closed.